Can you hear me through your screen? All right, perfect.
There we are. Hello.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to hang up. I can hear you. All right, hold on.
Okay, hi again. No, I can't hear you.
Okay, now you should be able to hear me.
Oh, yes.
Perfect. Okay. And then hello, Joan. Joan is already in our room. All right, perfect. I can hear you. I can see you. Do you want to go through your slides real quick? And
Well,
it's just the right and left
so
arrows.
what do you see on my slides? I also see the whole list of slides on the right-hand side.
So we can see this from our view, but the attendees, so
Okay.
you will actually be in a box kind of like over your slide, and they can actually move you. I need to remind them of that. Can move box.
So you only see my first slide. You don't see the rest of them.
I can see, yeah, I can see all of them, but the attendee will only
But they
see
won't.
whatever slide that we have up.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Let me walk through it. I'm just kind of scrolling through everything. I think that they should be good. Okay. Do you have any questions? Oh, you got it.
Yeah, let me just.
And then we'll just do questions at the end.
Yeah, questions at the end.
Do you want to read the questions, or do you want me to read you the questions?
You curate them. Looks like it's important for me to go through it once because there's a delay the first time, but not the second time. It's going to a gray screen before it goes to the next image. But if I go back, it comes right away now.
It's weird.
So
I've never noticed that before.
go through it all and
I'm excited to hear more about the garden key information.
I think you're now devoted to Fort Jefferson.
I went on a trip. We got invited out there because we sponsored the stipend for 2 artists for their artist in residence program. And it was absolutely incredible. We were there kind of 3 days, like the end of one day, and we were there 2 nights, and it was absolutely incredible just to see all of the different things that they're doing. We flew out there.
Where'd you stay?
Huh? We stayed in the fort.
Wow.
So it was good.
It's pretty amazing.
Well, just like I had no idea that there were people like biologists and, you know, people out there not only studying birds, but like also keeping track of the turtles and the nesting sites and the different types of turtles and how many of them actually hatched and, you know, how many of them unfortunately didn't. And it was really cool. And these artists that were there actually captured some of these moments where turtles were climbing out of the sand.
Oh, that is cool. No, the main naturalist there is a really good guy, and the superintendent is very supportive of research and you know, historic preservation and biology and everything else. It's a very good situation right now.
Yeah. So it was life-changing experience just to go out there. So can't wait to hopefully in the future get kids out there and to kind of see some of those same things that we saw.
Just think how close that is to Key West, right? And
yeah,
they never get there.
A lot of people have never been there.
They kind of know that it's out there somewhere, and then that's kind of about it. You know, there's no, it's not really part of modern Key West, yet it's so much a part of the history.
It really is. Well, all these forts, like right now, next week, I'm going to be talking to one of the schools about different foods in the Civil War. And so now I've kind of gone through some of the main letters and information you can find. So now I'm reading through some of the letters for soldiers that were stationed here in Key West to see what kind of foods they ate, because it's an island and everything grows on trees. So I wanted to see if they mentioned any of that. And they do, but it's incredible. Like, oh, they're talking about like these fortifications are being built and this is how far along they are. And it's just like, oh my gosh, it's really cool.
Can you get a hold of Tequesta? It's online. The history of Miami.
I haven't looked at any journal articles for that, but I've looked at Tequesta for some of the other topics.
So I'm going to put up here my article on the holders.
Okay.
And I also have an article coming out about Samuel Mudd.
Oh, that'll be a good one.
I trashed the guy.
Oh no. So do you think the cell is where he's at now, or which cell location do you think is probably closest?
Well, he was in
a couple times.
No, yeah, he was in several cells, and the one they show is one of them.
Okay.
But he just spent the whole time complaining, and he was guilty as can be. Yeah, I visited his home site in Maryland, and even they kind of wobble a little bit on the story, but no, he knew Booth, he knew what he was doing. He delayed the authorities. He lied to them throughout his stay. He was lying about the conditions he was in. He even lied about his role in the smallpox epidemic.
Where did you find all this information?
I had to dig deeply, but in fact, his one of his daughters saved all of the letters that he sent home and published them. I don't know, late 1800s, and then they were republished again by like a great grandson. So all of this documentation is there in these letters. His letters to him he didn't save, but letters back to his wife and the family were saved. And like he was complaining about no food. And the day that his wife went to President Johnson to complain about him not having food, he was describing their Christmas dinner and all the things they were having.
Hold on. Someone is asking. I'm so sorry. I'm probably going to butcher this name. Baron, we did not start early. We just wanted to log in early to make sure all of the technology was working properly. So welcome, and thank you for joining us early. But okay. Well, everything seems to be working because I know people are starting to funnel into the chat.
So we'll be quiet until you come
All right. So, yep, I'm going to turn my mic and my video feed off, and then I will come in right at 4 o'clock.
Can you manage my feed too, or should I do that?
You'll have to do it. I have
Okay,
faith in
well,
you. You can do it.
no. Let me mute the microphone.
You're good. All right. See you work. All right. I'm going to turn my feed and my mic off. Okay. All right, Jim, are you there? Jim, can you hear me?
Yay! Okay.
Testing 1, 2.
Cassandra, are you there? Jim, I'm Corey. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. I'm thinking Cassandra's having some computer problems down in her office. So.
Well, I had problems a minute ago. I came out and came back in, so now you can hear me, I guess.
Yeah, no, I can see you and I can hear you. I'm going to start the event in case people.
Yeah, shall we just begin?
I don't have your introduction in front of me. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Here, give me here, Cassandra, give me your thing. Come here. Okay, Cassandra's going to take my chair. Here you go. Okay.
Hi guys, I'm so sorry about that. I went through my whole intro.
You're not live. You're not live.
Okay, so
no, you're not started. Start the event.
Oh goodness, where am I going? Start here.
Yes.
I'm letting you do it. I can't say anything.
Are you?
What happened?
Is this live?
Yeah, it should be like good to go.
Oh, okay.
Are we good?
Yeah, go for it. All right, go ahead now.
All right, can everybody hear and see me?
I can. I can.
Yeah, because my box isn't on.
Okay, yeah, and our attendees can hear us. Everybody can see us. Hi.
All right, I see a yes, so we're going to start.
We're good to go.
All right, sorry guys, I did the entire introduction on my computer in the office and something very strange is going on. So hello, my name is Cassandra Collette and I'm the education specialist here at the Key West Art and Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for Dr. Jim Kushlin's talk, Seeking the American Tropics, South Florida's Early Naturalists. So before we begin, if you have any questions during this talk, please type them in the box on your screen and hit send. And at the end, we'll answer as many questions as possible. So also on your screen, the little box, and probably in your top right-hand corner if you're on a tablet or cell phone. As we're going through the presentation, if that box is in the way of an image, you can touch that box and move it over so that you can see the screen, or if there's a part that, or a chart or something that you'd like to see, you can do that. And as always, we have a donate button at the top of the screen. If you would enjoy this talk, or if you'd like to continue to support our educational programs, just please go ahead and hit that button before the end of the talk. And a huge thank you to everyone who has donated in the past. So our speaker this evening is Dr. James Kushlin. He is the author of 10 books and over 250 articles. James' writing shares with a wide audience his perspectives on science, conservation, natural history, and the connections among them. He has written extensively on the natural history and human history of South Florida, exemplified in his recent book, Seeking the American Tropics, South Florida's Early Naturalists. He also co-authored Dry Tortugas National Park, The History of the Dry Tortugas. And as an authority on water birds and the Florida Everglades, he's been a wildlife biologist, research center director, university professor, Smithsonian Research Associate, president of the American Ornithological Society, founder and chair of international conservation initiatives, and a board member of numerous professional and civic organizations such as History Miami Museum, Zoo Miami Foundation, and the Everglades Foundation. Welcome, James. Thank you for being here with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to share some of our thoughts and what we found out about the early naturalists who came into South Florida and over a couple hundred years had to determine exactly what the natural history of South Florida is. So as you mentioned, this was based on a recent book called Seeking the American Tropics and published by the University of Florida Press. And in the presentation, we're going to introduce a number of the topics that are covered in the book. But of course, the real interesting meat is way down in the book, and I urge you to pursue it further. Also, some of the material comes from our other books on history of South Florida, particularly the 3 books on the history of the national park. And particularly the brand new book on Everglades National Park, which was just published a couple of weeks ago. So some of the stories we're going to tell are also told in these books. We're going to start with the South Florida's early naturalists, which are the indigenous people of South Florida. We don't usually give enough credit to our indigenous people in South Florida, the people who were here when the Spanish arrived. But these were amazing civilizations, amazing cultures, because they were non-agricultural, dependent entirely on harvesting of natural resources. And we're learning about them primarily from their explorations of their towns and mounds. And we know very well about how they were intimately tied to the resources of the region. And so they had to be natural historians. And they were very sophisticated societies, as shown by the Marco cat, which is internationally famous artifact from the West Coast and now is on exhibit in Naples. The Spanish arrived in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, and we don't know much about Ponce de Leon's visit other than his itinerary, which was published 100 years later. But we do know where he went and what he found, particularly at the Tortugas. And these were focused on where ships could find water or food, or how they could get around South Florida. And in delving into what was known about Ponce de Leon's trip, he discovered two sources of fresh water, one in northern Biscayne Bay and one in southwest Florida in what is called Ponce de Leon Bay now. And given what my understanding of the Everglades, I finally put two and two together. And Juan Ponce de Leon discovered the two primary outflows of fresh water out of the Everglades. And these sources were used by mariners for centuries. 50 years later, a new governor came to Florida to get rid of the French and also to establish relationships with the Indians, which he did. And he established missions and fortifications at the two main towns, one of the Calusa and one of the Tequesta. And he left behind missionaries who wrote letters about how hard it was for them to be there. And these letters contain information on the Calusa and the Tequesta themselves, and also what they were eating and how they went about their lives. But for the most part, that's the end of Spanish engagement in South Florida. So for 250 years, Spain spent a great deal of effort in documenting the history and natural history of its empire. It hired historians who gathered up all of the reports and maps that were brought back by the military and private people who were in the New World. And this is an example from 1536. And that middle shows how careful their observations were from South America. But from South Florida, the Spanish have nearly nothing in their archives. And I spent some time thinking about this. Why? If they were documenting the rest of their empire, why not South Florida? And I came up with a few reasons. There was limited economic interest. They couldn't farm it. They couldn't establish missions. It was managed from St. Augustine, which was far away, and Havana, which pretty much only cared about the Florida Keys and the Tortugas and the reefs that were killing their ships. Nothing was novel in South Florida because the Spanish had already seen it in the Caribbean. All of the tropical vegetation that is in South Florida was also in the Caribbean. They knew it very well. You couldn't get there by land from St. Augustine, and if you did, it was entirely wetlands. And for hundreds of years, the indigenous people were not very friendly. The Spanish were mostly concerned with keeping them from killing shipwreck survivors. So for 250 years, really nothing emerged from South Florida relative to its natural history. Now, things changed when the British took over for a 20-year period. And in that period, Great Britain was very efficient and sent surveyors to find out about this new colony because they wanted it to settle it. And these were the three major surveyors who came to South Florida and explored both its geology and geography and natural history and wrote about them and developed maps and charts and books about what they found here. And their stories are just fascinating because the two on the top, Romans and de Brom, hated each other. And in the book, we go into a lot of detail about how they were fussing at each other over the entirety of their careers. They were two very different people. Romans was Dutch and de Brom was Prussian, and they just didn't get along. So de Brom didn't allow Romans to be paid. Romans sued de Brom back in England. He was taken back to England to account for himself. Eventually, Romans became a patriot, went to Philadelphia. De Brom continued to support the Loyalist cause in England. And they spent the rest of their lives criticizing each other. But by the end of this 20-year period, these three people had surveyed all of South Florida, and we had a very good idea now of what South Florida was all about. And they published it. So both published books about the natural history and the environment in South Florida. Now, the United States took over in 1821 and moved very, very quickly to establish the town of Key West and develop its lighthouses and its presence in South Florida, immediately getting down into Key West to make sure the Spanish intended to turn that over to the United States as well. And the most famous naturalist came to South Florida about 10 years later, and that was John James Audubon. Now, I've written quite an extensive paper on Audubon in South Florida that you can access in Tequesta magazine, which is History Miami's journal. And I think you just recently had a presentation on Audubon in Florida. And there are many, many stories that I cover in the book. But generally, when he came to Florida, to South Florida, he was very famous and the toast of America and England. And he came to find water birds for his next volume of the Birds of America. Essentially, the federal government opened its doors to Audubon and gave him a revenue cutter and crew to accompany him and take him to where he needed to go in the Florida Keys and to the Tortugas. When he arrived, he met up with Benjamin Strobel. And Strobel was Key West resident for a few years, a newspaper editor, the military doctor, and a naturalist himself, who had sent specimens back to Charleston, which Audubon had seen. So Strobel took care of him and made sure that he got around to Key West and had people there to help him hunt the birds. Strobel himself, we cover in some detail, had a very interesting time in Key West. He got tired of the assistant customs collector harassing him about the hospital, so they had a duel, and Strobel killed him and left Key West on the next ship back to Charleston, where he wrote up some of his observations. Another interesting person in the Audubon story is James Egan. Egan was a Bahamian. He and his mother had a Spanish land grant that was also acknowledged by the United States. And he became Audubon's guide. And I spent some time digging into Egan, and it was a little complicated because his name is also spelled Hagen, which would be the Bahamian pronunciation. And it was Egan who took Audubon around Florida Bay and Key West and showed him the most important discoveries that Audubon made, such as the great white heron shown here in Audubon's picture with Key West in the background. And so Egan was absolutely essential in Audubon's trip. Audubon credits him, but just as interesting that when Egan was carting Audubon around Florida Bay, he and his mother owned most of what eventually would be Miami. And so the stories just have layers and layers and layers. So Audubon is quite famous and our most famous early naturalist. But one thing I found out in this book that is he wasn't the earliest naturalist. This is Tischen Peel. He's the son of Charles Wilson Peel, who was an important portrait painter in the Revolutionary War period. He also had his own natural history museum in Philadelphia. And Peel had sons who helped him out with his collecting. And Tischen became a very good collector and was the youngest person ever elected to the Academy of Sciences. And Charles Lucien Bonaparte, who was writing The Birds of America, sent him down to Florida to collect birds. And Peel never wrote anything down. So we lose track of him in St. Augustine, yet he sent back specimens that had to come from South Florida, but there was no evidence that he ever got to South Florida. So doing research in the Key West Library, up on the wall is this drawing of early Key West, and it's a famous drawing because it's one of the earliest depictions. And I knew that drawing, but what became clear is that that's Peel's drawing. And so it's proof that Tischen Peel made it to Key West 5 years after the United States took over Florida and did his own collecting there, and then brought those specimens back. And Audubon referred to some of those specimens. As a matter of fact, he called the reddish egret Peel's egret. So here's our first South Florida's Florida naturalist. He's the son of a famous artist. He was there at the invitation of the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was clearly there at the invitation of David Porter, because this drawing is from Porter's porch. So how did he connect with Porter? And digging into the life of David Porter, it finally dawned on me that they were neighbors. Porter had his household right down the street from Peel's father's Natural History Museum in Philadelphia. So you had to, depending on who you knew, as to how you could get about. But Peel is our first formal naturalist in South Florida. Next came the Seminole Wars, and before this, all movements of naturalists or anybody else really were along the coast of South Florida. But in the Seminole War, the interior of South Florida was finally penetrated, and the person who began this was William Harney. And Harney set off from Miami with about 100 soldiers and sailors in canoes, not quite as depicted at the bottom because they were dressed like Indians. And they followed the trails and guides to locate Chiquita, who had attacked Indian Key. And they found him and hanged him. And Harney had a personal vendetta here to settle because Chiquita had attacked him and his troops in northern Florida. And only he and one other person escaped that attack in their underwear. And so he was determined to find Chiquita, and he did that. But important to our story is that he showed that you could penetrate the Everglades by canoe. So throughout the Seminole Wars, military parties were crisscrossing the Everglades, Big Cypress, the area south of Lake Okeechobee and around it, and sending back reports, taking notes, and also having other people with them who wrote down their observations. They also had local guides. The name Edner Liebner there, he was a botanist. He volunteered to guide some troops up to the coast of Florida, and he actually lost his life in 1837 by an Indian attack near Fort Lauderdale. But he was a tremendous collector and sent thousands of specimens back to Europe. Those who know Key West history might be surprised to see Stephen Mallory on this list, but he too guided for the military during the Seminole Wars. And he was asked to write a report to Congress about his findings about 10 years later. And his observations were very, very pertinent and very influential in Everglades history. So by the end of the Seminole War, the military had enough information to create a map of South Florida. And this was done by Lieutenant J.C. Ives, and it's shown here on the right. Tremendously detailed, accurate, just an amazing piece of work that he derived from all of the bits and pieces of information that had come back from these military campaigns across Florida. So finally, the interior of South Florida was becoming known, its natural history, its animals, its plants, and this happened because of the Seminole War. Between the two Seminole Wars in South Florida, the United States decided they really needed to know where South Florida was, particularly its islands, its bays, its coast, its coral reefs. And this was the job of the United States Coastal Survey. And most of us know the story of how they triangulated themselves down the coast from a baseline here on Key Biscayne. And from this baseline, very precisely measured. They triangulated all the way down the Keys, Florida Bay to Cape Sable to Key West, and then started again on the Tortugas. Finally putting in place then exactly the names and the places. And they also took lots of information on natural history, made collections, and wrote very extensive reports on what they were finding. The person responsible for this was Alexander Dallas Bakke. He was one of the foremost scientists of the time. He was in charge of the coastal surveys. He was a very precise scientist, very famous. He was also the great grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And you sort of had to be connected to get these kinds of jobs. But on his own, he was a very distinguished scientist. And he wasn't just a great grandson. Benjamin Franklin didn't have much to do with his son, but he had lots to do with his grandson. He brought his grandson and his family to Europe. And so Alexander actually grew up in the household of Benjamin Franklin. And as I said, became one of the great foremost scientists of his time, and was responsible for all the natural history observations of the survey. He also was prestigious enough to get Louis Agassiz down to Florida. Now, Agassiz was a Swiss, and he was the most famous scientist of the era. And Bakke contracted with him to study the coral reefs. So Agassiz came down through the coral reefs, through Key West to the Tortugas, studying the reefs. And the question was very simple. Are they alive or dead? Are they growing? And can they be somehow managed so that they stop sinking ships? He found out, yes, they're alive. No, they're not growing. And there's nothing you can do to keep them from sinking ships other than putting up lighthouses. He wrote a report to Congress that Bakke published, and Lewis's son, Alexander, published the entirety of the survey about 30 years later. So this was a tremendous amount of information on the offshore waters in South Florida by the greatest scientist of the era. So now we're to the Civil War, and of course, most everything stops during the Civil War, at least natural history observations and explorations, with one exception. And that's Dr. Joseph Holder on the dry Tortugas. And I've just published a paper on the Holder family and Tequesta, about 40 pages long, because they're just absolutely so fascinating. So Holder was hired to be the military doctor for the Corps of Engineers that was building Fort Jefferson at the time. But he, in addition to being a doctor, he was a naturalist. He founded a natural history society, had a museum. He was a student of Louis Agassiz. And so the Corps of Engineers and the Smithsonian really sent him down there to be a naturalist. So he spent the morning being a doctor and an afternoon being a naturalist. He and his family, his wife was Emily, his son is Charlie, went down for a year, and because of the war, ended up staying there for the entirety of the war. And so he spent 4 years. He built a research laboratory at Garden Key. He researched what was happening in the reefs and the interconnectivities. He had an aquarium that he studied the animals. And once he left, he wrote some wonderful articles in Harper Magazine that are illustrated with cartoons like the one shown here that really describe the natural history of the dry Tortugas. His wife also wrote up an account that was published by his son, Charles. Charles had a magazine in California that he published his mother's observations and his own. He also published a novel based upon his childhood there, and he grew up on the Tortugas. And he was a rather prestigious person himself. He founded the Rose Bowl Parade and discovered how to hunt tuna with rod and reel, and created big game fishing. So this is a just absolutely fascinating family. Emily is now regarded as one of the great women pioneers in South Florida. And her accounts, which you can find online, are just really detailed about what it was like to live on the dry Tortugas during the Civil War. So I'm great fans of the Holder family. So what happens after the Civil War? It's finally kind of opened up, but you had to be really tough to get into South Florida. The remnant Seminoles retreated to the middle of the state, middle of the Everglades and Big Cypress. The Seminole people were agriculturalists and herders, and they were not coastal. Yet they adapted amazingly to living within the Everglades and really living by themselves for a couple of decades, keeping white men away from them because they didn't trust them. And these were really the first people to learn how to live full time in the Everglades, in the interior wetlands, until about the 1870s, when trading posts were established and they started coming out to trade in the American economy. But also in this time, we're talking about 1860s, 70s, pioneers were coming into South Florida. And there was really nothing for them there. They tried farming, but they couldn't sell their produce. So they really lived off the land. They hunted, they fished, they had gardens in their backyard. And essentially they were living the same way as the indigenous people, living off the land and the natural resources. The Bradleys were one of these families. Moved into Vero Beach. Father was a barefoot mailman, then came to Miami, became school superintendent, and out to Cape Sable, where they were selling land. Very accomplished family. And another of the early pioneer residents was Ed Brewer, shown here in the upper right. Now, Brewer doesn't have his story told in any one place, but I kept running into his name and tracked him down as best I can. So Brewer was an outlaw, a moonshiner, always in trouble selling alcohol to the Seminoles. On the other hand, the Indians appreciated him a great deal. He wasn't allowed to live in Miami, so he lived out on Royal Palm Hammock on Taylor Slough, so as to avoid being annoying the Miami citizens. But he also was the guide for a guy named Hugh Willoughby, shown in the middle there. And you can still buy Willoughby's book about his travel across the Everglades by canoe. And there's lots of natural history observations in there, and it's a very worthwhile review of the Everglades before drainage really took hold. But Willoughby was there really for self-aggrandizement. He came in with a military load of equipment, and it was kind of a farce. He immediately broke his nose, and then he lost all his photographic plates. So the picture we see him here in his very heroic stance was taken by Commodore Ralph Monroe from Coconut Grove. And that's Monroe's gun and Monroe's canoe and even Monroe's crocodile that he's standing over. So his observations are very worthwhile, but he himself went on tour and publicized the Everglades and got to be part of the Explorers Club and came back to Florida to sell land later. The person I really admire in this period is Arthur Dimmock, shown in the right with a manatee. He was a successful businessman, and then he became an adventure writer. And for 10 years came to West Florida. He had his own boat and skiffs and explored all of the west coast of Florida and wrote about it in articles and books. And I really recommend his books because his writing was really wonderful and very insightful natural history. Also in the Civil War, then some professional naturalists finally started making it into Florida. And this is W.E.D. Scott. He was an ornithologist. And for 10 years, he came to West Florida to collect birds, or actually have other people collect birds for him. And it is said that the coins that he paid for these birds were some of the only hard currency circulating around West Florida about the time. And he was there long enough and observed sufficiently that he was able to document the destruction of the rookeries of wading birds along the west coast of Florida. These were the egrets, and hunters were going in and killing out the colonies. And he was able to document that. And this, of course, was for their plumes. There's a great egret showing his nuptial plumes, and the other picture is how they ended up on ladies' hats. So remember I said that there wasn't much you can do in South Florida for money. Well, this was the best thing you could do as a pioneer, was to kill these birds to sell their plumes. And this was really the basis of the economy in South Florida. You could sell some alligator hides and some otter hides, but this is where the money was. So these colonies were shot out year after year after year throughout South Florida, the Keys, the Florida Bay, and the West Coast. And Scott was able to document this. And this played very importantly into the role of conservation, starting the Audubon societies and the anti-plume movement. It was wading birds, too, that brought other professional naturalists. This is Frank Chapman, American Museum of Natural History, who came down to South Florida in 1908. And his purpose was to go to Cuthbert Rookery, which is near Flamingo, and to get photographs. He was a photographer, and he had his artists with him in order to create a diorama in the American Museum of Natural History. And this is still there in the museum. It's the oldest exhibition in the museum, and it itself is historic. And it was meant to help stop the plume trade by telling the people what the real story was in the rookery, that all these birds were being killed for their feathers. Chapman arrived 3 years before Chapman's arrival. Guy Bradley, who had been hired by Chapman to be the warden in Florida Bay out of Flamingo, was murdered. And his murder by plume hunters from Key West became a national sensation, and he became the martyr of the cause that became the anti-plume cause and the beginning of American conservation movement. So getting up into the late 1800s, as in most things, Flagler's Railroad changed everything. You could finally get to South Florida, buy land relatively easily. All it took was the price of a ticket. When you got there, you had this magnificent hotel or a lot of other lesser accommodations that grew up very quickly around the hotel in the new Miami. And people started pouring in. And for the first time, naturalists could finally get there easily. Just like everybody else, they could board the train in the winter, get away from their laboratories or their dead botanical gardens, come down and find a place to stay and explore South Florida. And that's what they did. So Flagler's Railroad, for all of its negative connotations in the destruction of the environment, allowed naturalists to finally come here easily. And it also brought millionaires. Now, we have a whole chapter. I have a whole chapter in the book about the millionaires in South Florida that facilitated the natural history discovery of the area. And this is something that was not previously really understood, because these guys kept to themselves. They didn't keep much in the way of records. They didn't have to. They were private. They were interested in botany and natural history because that's what they were interested in. They didn't need anybody else to know, and they didn't need anybody to write it down. The left-hand picture is a camping trip that Henry Ford, who himself was a keen naturalist, talked Thomas Edison into taking into the Big Cypress Swamp. Ford brought with him John Burroughs, who was the greatest nature writer of the period. Of course, Ford is younger than Edison, and both of them were quite younger than Burroughs. So here are three extraordinarily important people in science and natural history out in the Big Cypress. Burroughs hated it, went home immediately, had a tepid response, did no research himself, and they really had a terrible time. The first night out, they just got rained on, and in the left-hand corner, way over there, you can see their blankets hanging out to dry. But these millionaires were extraordinarily important because they gave impetus to natural history studies in South Florida. So here's Ford, Edison, and Firestone, who established a research laboratory in Fort Myers. And the purpose of this laboratory, which Edison went to in the winter, was primarily to find a new source of rubber. And so it was a botanic research laboratory, and Edison engaged all of the local botanist naturalists to find him plants that he could test to see if they had any rubber. So this new source of rubber was, of course, important to Firestone, who needed it for his tires, and Ford, who needed it to put tires to put on his car, and Edison, who liked to discover things, and also is looking for new ways to make an impact. So this was a very important research laboratory devoted to botany and particularly rubber. Another laboratory was put out on the Tortugas, and this was the contribution of Andrew Carnegie, not directly, but Carnegie funded the Carnegie Institute of Washington, who decided that to establish a marine laboratory and to put it on the Tortugas. This was the work of Alfred Mayer, shown in the upper left, who managed the laboratory for 20 years, convinced Carnegie to put it there, and it became one of the great research laboratories of the country. For over 30 years, scientists came in the wintertime to spend a couple of months. Mayer would invite the greatest scientist of the nation to come and spend a couple of months, expenses paid. And they published hundreds of papers and thousands of pages of research that was done on the Tortugas laboratory, one of the most important marine laboratories in the world for its time. And those are the buildings on Loggerhead Key on the Dry Tortugas. That windmill pumped salt water through aquarium that they could do their research and experiments. Of course, over time, Mayer died in the Tortugas in 1922, and over time, hurricanes took their toll. So this is what is left of the laboratory. You can see the lighthouse on the Loggerhead Lighthouse in the distance, and there's a plaque honoring Mayer. But during its time, it was an exceptionally important research facility. Charles Deering is a real central player in the story in the book, and a large part of a chapter is devoted to Charles Deering. He created International Harvester from the merger of two farm equipment companies, was devoted to art and to natural history. And he came down to South Florida in the winter. He had first an estate in North Miami and then down in Cutler. And you can visit his estate called the Deering Estate at Cutler. It's a county park now. And he protected the hammock there, but also was very concerned about the loss of some of the birds in South Florida, particularly the egrets that had been pretty much exterminated at the time. Also brown pelicans that were killed off by fishermen. And this is a story that research for the book extracted because, as I mentioned before, he didn't say very much. He just did what he did on his own. But the story found actually came from E.A. McElhenney. McElhenney is from Avery Island. He was a naturalist. He studied alligators. He had his own rookery where he had captive birds that he was breeding to bring back into the wild. And McElhenney reports that he sold 2 railroad carloads of snow egrets to Charles Deering. And clearly Deering brought them back to Buena Vista, north of Miami, into these pens that he had built. And he tried to rear them so as to reintroduce them to South Florida. I found these images in the History of Miami collection. They're not particularly well labeled, but by putting together the story, these are clearly the pens that Charles Deering had built in order to reestablish snowy egrets. Well, Deering also supported visiting naturalists. And the most important one is John Kunkel Small, who's a botanist, New York Botanical Garden. And for 30 years, every winter, he came down to South Florida to study the flora. Every year he wrote a report that was published by the New York Botanical Garden about what he saw and what he did and how things were changing. This is what he called his weed wagon, where he was collecting plants wherever he could go in South Florida over this period of time. Down at the bottom, this boat is named the Barbie. It belongs to Charles Deering. It was his work boat. And here they're out collecting cactus on Cape Sable. The fellow in the middle is also a famous South Florida naturalist, Charles Torrey Simpson. And Simpson had this wonderful, wonderful backstory that I go into great detail just because it's so entertaining. He was not educated. He was all self-made. He became a collector very early, particularly of mollusks. He was in the Civil War and the Navy. He was a carpenter. He was a farmer. He came to West Florida with some friends. Explored, was the first to find the palm trees, royal palm trees down in Southwest Florida. But he needed to leave. He got in trouble for being too much of a Yankee supporter and also for having an affair with his wife's nurse. But he went back and he was recognized for his expertise and was given a job at the Smithsonian. And it was said he could recognize thousands of species of snails by sight. After a while, he got tired of not being promoted and retired to South Florida and lived here another 30 years, where he traveled everywhere, mostly by himself, to explore South Florida. And he wrote about it, not only in magazine articles, but in several wonderful books, including the two shown here, that I highly recommend because he was such a beautiful writer and was so insightful in his natural history observations. Became quite famous locally. He was a resident, unlike many of the naturalists that came and went every year. Lived in Little River, on the Little River, where he had his garden of thousands of plants. He received the first honorary degree from the University of Miami and was extremely well-respected elder in the community. Same time, John Gifford moved to South Florida. Now, where Simpson was self-educated, Gifford was highly educated. He had a PhD in forestry and is considered the first forester in America to have a PhD. After a year teaching in Cornell, he decided that he didn't like what was happening there and he moved to South Florida. Digging deeply, turns out he was wealthy, his wife was wealthy, and he came down and became a developer and a banker. But of course, always retained his interest in trees and wrote extensively on South Florida, particularly its trees. What he wanted to do was develop South Florida so that people could live here and farm here and have trees here. And what he's doing in this picture is admiring something he took great pride in, and that is the introduction of the Melaleuca tree to South Florida, the paperbark, the cajeput. He wanted to drain the Everglades, not by levees and canals, but by planting it up with trees. And the seeds were brought in from Australia and scattered throughout the Everglades. And we know what a great job that turned out to be. So this exotic species is spread all over South Florida in the wetlands. It's a biological desert, and tens of millions of dollars have been spent to eradicate it. Gifford, while a tremendously gifted scientist and naturalist, kind of posed some of the environmental threats, began some of the environmental threats to South Florida. And as a matter of fact, these introductions of non-native species was a theme of most of the naturalists. And not only Gifford, David Fairchild for 40 years was in charge of plant introductions for the United States Department of Agriculture. He established plant introduction stations in Miami, including on Charles Deering's estate, and paid people like Simpson to grow the plants that he brought in and to spread them around. And so he was very instrumental in bringing in non-native introductions. Fairchild is known mostly after his retirement in 1928, when he moved to Coconut Grove with his wife, who was the daughter of Alexander Graham Bell, and became a quite distinguished citizen and supporter of Everglades Park and so forth. But his early part of the career, he was instrumental in these introductions. Charles Deering, who we credit with snowy egrets and funding John Kunkel Small, introduced hundreds of species of animals, hundreds of species into South Florida, dozens of species of mammals and birds, trying to increase the diversity in South Florida, which he thought was wanting. So while these were tremendous naturalists who were helping us understand South Florida, they were also literally planting the seeds of some of its destruction. This time also, though, was the beginning of conservation in South Florida. And this started with Royal Palm Hammock. Now, Royal Palm Hammock is at Anhinga Trail, Taylor Slough, It's the first stop after the visitor center when you go into Everglades National Park from Homestead. And when it was first discovered, it was one of the most diverse tropical hammocks in South Florida, and characterized by hundreds of royal palm trees. Simpson went there in the early 1900s. It took him 3 days to get there. But he always sang its praise, and it was well known by naturalists. But what happened is that Henry Flagler was given a lot of land by the state of Florida in compensation for building the railroad to Key West. And this land was located past Royal Palm Hammock on the way to Cape Sable, including Cape Sable in the Flamingo area. So after his death, his company wanted to sell this land, and the easiest way to do that was to build a road, and that road went right through the hammock. So local naturalists became concerned. They brought this concern to the attention of a Coconut Grove resident named Mary Monroe. Monroe was the wife of Kirk Monroe, who was a famous writer and outdoorsman, wrote children's book, boys' adventure books based on South Florida, was one of the most popular writers of his time. And Mary was the conservationist. She got manatees declared the state animal. She founded Audubon societies and women's clubs. And she heard about this and went to Henry Flagler's widow, went to the Land Development Company, went to May Jennings, who was the conservation chairman of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs. Her husband had just stopped being governor, very influential. And together they started this campaign to preserve Royal Palm Hammock. These were the founders of South Florida conservation, not the men naturalists. It was the Women's Club of South Florida, that began the conservation movements. So Royal Palm Park became a reality in 1915. There wasn't any funding for it, so the women's clubs had to piece together funding. And they managed to preserve this park for 30 years. And it was on the tourist destination, and it became the kernel, the core of Everglades National Park. So the picture on the lower right is that of the Women's Club donating its park to Everglades National Park on October 11th, 1947. And I kind of need to mention that date because while that ceremony was taking place, I was busy being born. So I have some connection to it. So many of these stories have a lot of depth to them. And I'm also telling many of them in these books. For example, the Marine Lab and the Holder story are told in Dry Tortugas book. The Royal Palm Park story is told in our new Everglades book. And the wonderful thing about these series is they're based on archival photographs. And so you really can kind of get a feeling for the stories that are told verbally in more depth in the other book. So now we're into the 20s through the 40s, and essentially natural history studies came to a halt. A ship was blocking the Miami port, which ended the boom. The hurricane came through in 26. The World War came through, and those are men exercising in gas masks on Miami Beach. And essentially, natural history, observations, studies, and exploration stopped for a couple of decades. They kicked back up again in the late 50s and 60s. And in fact, that's where I had the opportunity in the late 60s through early 80s to be a biologist in the Everglades during my doctoral theses, and also as a biologist at Everglades National Park. And since that time, there's been an amazing amount of research and natural history and science that has been done in South Florida. By this time, South Florida, which 150 years ago was essentially unknown biologically, is now one of the best studied regions in the entire world. So let me do a little bit of summarizing. For 2.5 centuries, Spain, although it was terribly concerned with natural history in its empire, ignored South Florida. And so South Florida played no role in the golden era of natural history in Europe and the colonies. In its only 2 decades, Great Britain produced substantive surveys of the coast and the natural history, And when the U.S. took over, it quickly established itself in Key West to provide access to naturalists such as Peel and Audubon. The Seminole Wars opened the interior to investigation. And after the Civil War, the Seminoles, pioneers, plume hunters, scientists, sportsmen, writers were able to make their way back into the Everglades with a lot of difficulty. The railroad brought both naturalists and seasonal millionaires who supported them to South Florida. I'm entitling this The Naturalists and the Ironies That Are South Florida, which actually is the last chapter title of the book, because all of this is so tremendously ironic. And maybe that's what South Florida is all about, is irony. But while the men naturalists, and they were nearly all men, because women didn't get jobs being naturalists at that time, increased our knowledge, they also influenced and helped both document and enhance the destruction of South Florida. Remember that John Gifford was a developer himself. And this was countered by the women who founded the conservation movement in South Florida. There was a decades-long pause, and then over the last 40, 50 years, 60 years, there's been a tremendous increase in knowledge, so that by now South Florida is one of the best known pieces of the planet. So thank you very much for that, and we do really appreciate the opportunity to share that with you.
All right, Jim, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, perfect. Okay, we do have a couple questions.
Sure.
So when you were talking about Dr. Joseph Holder, we had a question related to that. MPM says, you speak of sending specimen back. What were they specimens of? Feathers, shells, drawings, soil?
Oh, yes. It depended on the specialty of the naturalist. So Layden was a botanist, and Simpson was both a botanist and a malacologist who collected shells. He had a shell collection of something like 40,000 shells. 20,000 of them were tree snails. Holder collected for the Smithsonian, so all of the invertebrates and fishes that are out on the reef, he would pickle up and preserve and send them back to the museums. So it depended really on what the interest was of the collector. But during this era, collecting was what natural history was all about, because that's what you determine what species were there and in what abundance. We don't do so much collecting today because we more or less know what species are here. But collecting was a way of life for naturalists. As a matter of fact, Chapman, who founded bird watching and bird photography, did that to stop people from watching birds with a shotgun, to try to keep people from killing birds and encouraging them to look at them instead. I can't actually see the.
That's okay. So the next question, it's a little out of context, but are there many of the non-native animals still there?
Well, from Deering's introductions, no, none of them took. Otherwise, we'd be overrun with pheasants and everything else. Now, the peacock is still around, but that was probably introduced by any number of people. Now, that being said, although those introductions were unsuccessful, we do now know that the non-native species, both plants and animals, that have established themselves in South Florida are just devastating the environment. Everybody's heard about pythons, and they're as bad as you hear. They're just eating up everything. The canals are full of non-native fish from Africa and from South America. Non-native plants are always encroaching in the remnants of our native habitat. So these non-native species, exotic species, are terrible, terrible problems in conserving South Florida today, and require tremendous amount of effort to try to keep in check. So while the early naturalists were sometimes not successful, Gifford and his Melaleuca tree and also Australian pine trees were tremendously successful in covering hundreds of square miles of the Everglades.
So our next question, are there or were there crocodiles in Florida? Are they still here, or is it just alligators?
Oh, no, absolutely. I had the great pleasure of studying both alligators and crocodiles many years ago. Crocodile, the American crocodile is native to South Florida. It's always been here. And yes, alligators too are native for the most part. Alligators tend to freshwater, crocodiles tend to the coast, brackish or salt water. But they're also found in Cuba and in northern South America. And absolutely, they're native. Now, when Commodore Monroe and Dimmock and Willoughby were trying to catch crocodiles, it was very exciting because they had just recently been discovered as being in South Florida. And they were justifying catching crocodiles so that they could send them off to zoos. There's a wonderful picture of Dimmock catching a crocodile near Madeira Bay that he was going to send back to the New York Zoological Society. Dimmock's son Julian was a fantastic photographer, and his pictures were as important as his father's words in documenting South Florida. But yeah, absolutely, crocodiles are not only here, they are reclaiming most of their range. They're in as good a shape as they have been probably in a century since people started encroaching on their habitat. You can see them on Key Biscayne and in Biscayne Bay, at Fairchild, and they're very much recovered from the state that they were in 50 years ago.
And she says, Jim, wonderful presentation, and also thank you to Kirsten for advertising the program. Do you know of any resources for fossil shells?
For what, please?
For fossil shells.
Oh, yes. Edward Patuch, Patuch, now retired professor from Florida Atlantic University, has written extensively on the fossil shells of Florida and has several beautifully illustrated books on fossil shells. And he used these shells to help us understand how the Everglades developed. Turns out the Everglades developed on a ring of coral reefs, and he was able to determine this from his fossil studies. So Patuch, P-E-T-U-C-H, you'll be able to find his books, and that are just not only interesting, but also beautifully done.
One more question before we wrap up. Was Deering successful with avian propagation?
Yes and no. It didn't work out with the snowy egrets. To some extent, that's fortunate because the reason we know about the snowy egrets is that one of his aviculturists actually wrote about the project. Deering never wrote about it. But what he did do was help reintroduce brown pelicans. So he had this approach where he would keep these birds in a cage, and then eventually, once they became acclimated and were nesting there, would open up the cage and let them fly loose, and then they'd come back. And so he did this for brown pelicans and actually had a house, and he would buy, or his people would buy, hundreds of pounds of fish, and the brown pelicans would come back to the enclosure and the canals on the estate and be fed fish every day. So he was very successful in kind of reestablishing the brown pelican, but the snowy egrets never worked.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. And sorry again to everyone for the technical issues in the beginning on that.
So thank you for holding on through them.
Yeah, right, exactly. So if you guys haven't already signed up for our next DSS, it's going to be African American Politics by Sharon Austin, and that will take place on December 2nd from 4 to 5. So be sure to check out our website, aquas.org, and hit the events and programs tab, and then sign up for that. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you again, Jim.
Well, thank you.